What does it take to make a person? Is it our physical bodies, our consciousness, or our memories? Or maybe it's a mix of all of these. People have wrestled with these questions about who we are and what makes us conscious for centuries. But with the rise of artificial intelligence, these age-old questions suddenly feel a lot more urgent. They're no longer just philosophical thought experiments. They're real life and they're happening now. As technology begins to blur the boundaries between human and machine, we find ourselves searching for answers in the same place we've always turned to for possible insight: science fiction. And there's one show, a science fiction show, that brilliantly explores this intersection of identity, innovation, and technology, and that's Black Mirror. In fact, there are 3 specific episodes, Beyond the Sea, Be Right Back, and The Entire History of You, that explore different answers to the same profound question: what are we made of? These stories each propose a theory of the human. Are we our bodies? Are we our data? Or are we our memories? They then push that theory to its limits and show us what happens when that theory is taken seriously. Number 1. Are we our bodies? In Beyond the Sea, 2 astronauts, Cliff and David, pilot a deep space mission while their consciousness is transmitted back to replicas of themselves on Earth. When David's replica is destroyed in a gruesome home invasion, he becomes confined to space, unable to return to Earth in any form. In an act of compassion, Cliff offers David access to his own replica during off hours. But David's use of Cliff's body soon crosses boundaries, culminating in violence that reveals the terrible cost of confusing embodiment with identity. The episode asks whether the body is the essential vessel of the self or merely a tool. If our thoughts can be separated from our flesh and still persist, what does the body mean? Immanuel Kant might say the body is part of the phenomenal world, the visible shell, but that the true self resides in the nominal, the realm beyond perception. But this episode complicates this. David's estrangement from his body distorts his very humanity. Without the sensory limits, the social cues, and the mortality that the bodies enforce, David becomes dislocated, dangerously abstracted. The tragedy in this episode unfolds not simply because boundaries are crossed, but because the distinction between the self and the body has become dangerously blurred. This episode seems to ask, what is the role of the body in personal identity? If our consciousness can be uploaded, projected, and transplanted, are we still our bodies? Or are our bodies just containers or costumes? This is the kind of question that animates centuries of philosophical debate. René Descartes famously posited a dualism between mind and body, suggesting that the essence of the self lies in thought. I think, therefore I am. But Beyond the Sea, this episode, complicates this dualism. Even if consciousness can survive apart from the flesh, something essential is lost in that separation. Immanuel Kant might offer a middle ground. He argued that we experience the world not as it is, but as it appears to us through space, time, and embodiment, the phenomenal realm. The body, for Kant, is not the self, but a necessary condition through which the self interacts with the world. Without the body, experience becomes unmoored from meaning. Number 2. Are we our memories? This episode imagines a world where people possess grains, devices that record everything they see and hear, allowing them to rewatch and scrutinize their own lives. Liam, the protagonist, becomes obsessed with his wife's ambiguous interactions with another man, replaying past conversations, analyzing body language, and spiraling into paranoia. His fixation on forensic memory eventually destroys the very relationship he's trying to protect. At first glance, the episode seems to portray memory as a reliable record, an infallible truth. But in his book, On the Advantage and Disadvantage of History of Life, Nietzsche offers a more complex view that helps us understand why the entire history of you feels so unsettling. For Nietzsche, memory is essential. Without it, we lose the continuity that shapes our identity. Yet he also warns against an excess of memory, especially when it becomes historical in nature, burdening us so heavily that we become paralyzed. Nietzsche calls this overburdened figure the historical man, someone who cannot forget and is thus haunted by the past to the point of spiritual exhaustion. He who cannot forget will never amount to much, he writes. Memory in this sense is a double-edged sword. It is necessary for growth and learning, but can also suffocate vitality and spontaneity. Nietzsche's notion that forgetting is essential to action of any kind resonates deeply here. Forgetting is not a failure or a flaw, but an active faculty, a vital part of how we live freely and love fully. Ultimately, Nietzsche insists memory must serve life, not the other way around. It should empower us, not haunt us. The entire history of you dramatizes what happens when memory is untethered from life's needs. Liam's Descent reveals that we are more than the sum of our memories. To be human is to live in this tension between remembering and forgetting, between knowing and mystery. This episode suggests that the fullness of selfhood cannot be reduced to perfect recall. It requires the gaps, the forgetting, the unknown. That is what forms the self. Number 3. Are we our bodies, our memories, and our minds? Of all the episodes in this trilogy of inquiry, Be Right Back is the most hauntingly holistic. It attempts to reconstitute a person from everything we typically associate with selfhood: the physical body, the accumulated memories, the patterns of speech and thought. And still, something's missing. After Martha's partner, Ash, dies in a car accident, she turns to a technology that can bring him back. First as a chatbot trained on his entire digital footprint, then as a voice on the other end of a phone call, and eventually an eerily lifelike synthetic body that walks, speaks, and even touches like Ash. The software pulls from Ash's texts, emails, videos, and voice notes to approximate his personality. As Martha interacts with this artificial Ash, the viewer is invited to ask, what exactly is missing? The 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume famously dismantled the idea of a fixed, coherent identity. When he looked inward, Hume didn't find a self. He found only a bundle of perceptions in constant flux. Thoughts, feelings, sensations, flickering and vanishing without any underlying substance holding them up together. The self, for Hume, is not a thing, but a fiction, a useful illusion. And yet, Hume was left with a paradox he could never quite resolve. Why does the illusion of the self persist if it is merely a construction? Why do we continue to experience this fluid montage of data as the self? The artificial Ash is a mirror without mystery. He is data arranged to behave like a person. As Hume might put it, a bundle, but not a self. What's striking here is that Be Right Back assembles the full toolkit of modern selfhood: memory, body, personality, language, and still it can't resurrect the person. The illusion is nearly complete, but the soul of it is absent. The episode suggests that what's missing isn't just a technical glitch, it's something fundamental, something non-replicable. The synthetic Ash has everything about Ash, but nothing of him. He is an imitation of presence, not the thing itself. In this way, Be Right Back becomes the perfect synthesis of the prior questions. It asks, if we recreate the body and collect the memories and encode the behavior, do we get the person? No, we don't. Because there's something more, something that slips past the net of language, memory, sensation, and code. Something transcendent, in the sense that it exceeds any knowing mechanism for replication or explanation. So then, what are we? What Black Mirror reveals through these 3 haunting episodes is not just a fear of what technology might become, but a mirror held up to what we might forget about ourselves. When we try to decode or recreate that humanity through the lens of technology, when we imagine we can store the soul in a hard drive or upload the self to the cloud, we end up hollowing out the very thing we seek to preserve. These stories are not just about what technology can't do, they're about what we mustn't forget. That there is a sacred excess to being human, a depth that refuses simplification. In the end, Black Mirror doesn't just warn us about machines, it warns us about what happens when we let their logic define us, when we treat love as data, presence as code, and consciousness as a feature to be simulated. We risk losing the very thing that makes us human in the first place. Because the real danger is not that we be replicated by machines, it's that we'll start to believe we are one. So maybe what these stories point out is not just what makes us human, but what makes being itself so strange and sacred. Because if we're more than our bodies, more than our minds, and more than our memory, then what are we? And is this mystery, this invisible, ungraspable core, something uniquely human? Or Is it the shape of all life, all existence? A kind of presence behind the veil of what can be measured. A kind of soul, not just in us, but in being itself. Behind our thoughts and memories is a presence we didn't build and can't explain. Something no code can capture. And maybe that thing isn't exclusive to humanity, but something in the very fabric of being. A sort of soul, not just in us, but perhaps in everything. So if this is the conclusion we arrive at, how would it change the way we think, feel, remember, and ultimately live?